When we think about how massive our debt is, can we somehow use gold? Or, I mean, I know we heard Trump say we'll pay it off with a crypto credit card, but I don't think that's happening anytime soon with Bitcoin. But is there a plan to somehow address our debt?
I think individuals can have plans, but are there enough individuals together that have a collective plan? My guess would be no. But the individuals do. As far as using gold to do it, I mean, there is a on the books mechanism to do this. It's not like you'd have to think it up. It's already there in like the Fed operating handbook, which is basically that they can reprice gold.
Yeah.
And by doing so, they basically get credited in the Treasury General account with the amount of the increase. There's a couple more details than that, but that's basically, it's one of the very few mechanisms the government can do under current law where they can spend without issuing debt.
Mm-hmm.
But it instead involves, it's a type of default in a way. You're devaluing the dollar relative to gold.
Yeah.
Now, there is a little bit of a free lunch currently, or kind of more like an untapped check there, which is that if they only devalue the dollar relative to gold to current market prices, because they have it on the books back in like 1970s prices.
40 something an ounce.
Yeah, something like that. So if they were to reprice it to current levels, that's just kind of reflecting an untapped thing that they still have.
Mm-hmm.
The optics would be questionable at that point. Like the whole point, a lot of these, it's dollar included, a lot of this is based on confidence. So it would maybe it would get people talking, but that could make some degree of mechanical sense. Now they technically could reprice it higher than the current level. You could use that approach to price gold higher.
They could just pick a price like 5,000 an ounce.
Yeah, they can pick other numbers, but they have a cost, which is so they would then fill the TG up. They'd be able to spend without issuing debt. It would look kind of like QE at a pretty big scale. But it would even look more. They would look like, potentially fiscal combined with QE, depending on what they decided to do with that money. It'd be kind of the very pro liquidity move. So it'd probably be very good for asset prices. Around the margins, it probably would be inflationary. If gold goes up a ton, other metals could follow suit. Some of those have utility purposes, which could then make the things they go into more expensive. Combined with all this liquidity that's now sloshing around the system. That is something that they can do, but it's basically a way of devaluing the debt and running it hot. And that's kind of, instead of doing it by 6 to 7% a year, like the deficit numbers we have, that's kind of like pulling the Band-Aid off and getting a lot done at once. With the challenging part being that there's still no plan in place to then fix the bleeding going forward. So, for example, if we look back at World War II, they obviously had huge deficits, huge inflation, but then part of the way they got out of it in two main ways together. One, they did inflate a lot of it away. So if you were holding bonds or cash, you just compared to everything else you could have owned, you got devalued. You paid for it. But then two, they grew out of it while doing austerity as well. Mm-hmm. So it was like basically the inflation was a type of default. Not a nominal default, but it's a purchasing power default. So they said, okay, we're basically defaulting on a big percentage of our existing liabilities, but then we are going to more or less balance our budget for, the next generation. That's kind of what they did. And so if they just do the devaluation, but then they don't, fix the actual ongoing deficit leakage, that's more like an emerging market at that point. If they focus everything on trying to fix the leakage, but then they still have this big, debt pile that's not been sufficiently, kind of defaulted on or devalued, then there's still risk for, that still lies ahead.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that 1-2 punch happens. We've already seen a partial bond devaluation, like the past 5 years, 6 years have been awful for bond and cash holders relative to practically every other asset class.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's done yet, basically. I don't think the next 5 years maybe will be as significant in that regard as those 5-6 years were. But it's not as though we've kind of completed that full cycle and are back to some sort of sustainable baseline.
But it's the risk-free asset institutions can hold, even if it's underwater. We've seen the outperformance in gold, and people like Ray Dalio, all the biggest investors, they're coming out, they're saying, 10, 15% of your portfolio in gold now. Why do you think Bitcoin has sort of underperformed? I mean, it's a digital gold. It solves for some of the defects in the physical version. So why do people, even though I know we're up 100% since last year, by the way, but people are feeling kind of bearish about the whole situation?
I think it's because it's reality versus expectations. Part of why I've not been that disappointed is because I've been more in I sometimes describe myself as like a bearish bull.
Yeah.
On Bitcoin, I try to always have conservative bullish targets,
Sure.
which is that it's like I'm always like I think it's going to outperform things, but I don't think it's going to the moon anytime soon. And we can talk about why that is, but part of the reason I like to hold both is because they don't always perform well at the same time. Sometimes Bitcoin gets ahead of itself, sometimes gold gets ahead of itself.
Right now it's gold.
Yeah, gold's the larger asset by a factor of about 10. A lot of the biggest pools of capital still understand it better than Bitcoin. Bitcoin's viewed more as like a tech play, something that is to do homework on to figure out. Whereas gold is, been around for a while. I sometimes I get a little concerned around Bitcoin getting ahead of its skis. Other times I get a little concerned around gold getting ahead of its skis. Right now, I mean, gold, just by more metrics, is kind of sentiment overbought. Even though I still think the long-term case for it is good. But I mean, over the next 6-12 months, I put my vote for Bitcoin. I think that kind of that rotation, and I could be wrong in this. Maybe we look back 12 months from now and maybe gold still outperformed again. But my guess would be Bitcoin is probably going to take over for a while. I think partially we had to see some of the MNAVs, like overvalued MNAVs of treasury companies deflate to some extent. Once we saw like altcoin treasury companies coming to market, basically at that point, you just kind of have to expect there's going to be a washout to kind of get the kind of tourists out of the system, both in Bitcoin and around Bitcoin. But then that allows for a platform to rebuild from. And now that we see the Fed getting a little bit more dovish, we've seen some of that kind of already get washed out. I think Bitcoin's in a better place for the next 6-12 months. Going forward would be my base case.
Well, I wanted to get your outlook on the Bitcoin treasuries because to your point, a lot of the MNAVs have compressed. People are feeling a little bit bearish. Some of them have really gotten decimated recently. I know that was largely due to some lockups that came up and then obviously people sold. But how are you feeling about the Bitcoin treasuries and how should people evaluate them? Because for so many people that I hear from, it's like, well, MSTR is really the proven one. And especially with the new credit instruments that they've put out, they have a difficult time figuring out how to value the other treasury companies.
Yeah, and I think it's a new industry, so it makes sense. Many of them do have elements that are speculative. The only one that I've ever owned is MicroStrategy. I would own Metaplanet in certain valuations. So I've been watching that one now that it's come down. I think that one's very well managed. I think those are kind of the two cream of the crop that are out there. I think what makes a good one is that you generally want to be the liquidity leader in your market. So in the US, that's MicroStrategy. In Japan, that's Metaplanet. There are other opportunities for other big capital markets as well. I think the market's made it clear that if one is unprofitable, they tend to put a pretty big discount on that, just because they view it as a liability to the longer term Bitcoin strategy. In addition, if you're the third, fourth, fifth, sixth most liquid one at what you're doing, it's just challenging. Now, that's where they can add differentiation. If one has cash flows, they can kind of market that and say we're a hybrid entity. We have this other business that's not Bitcoin, and so you can kind of put the two together and they can balance out each other's risk. So they have to kind of explore what's going to work for the market. But I do think it's healthy that a lot of this was washed out, just because whenever something starts to look like free money, that's when more entities are going to come in. That's when you're going to get, like I said, there were like altcoin treasury companies coming to market. It kind of needed a reset. I still think the model makes sense, which is, and there's a couple of different models here. One is the pure play. I think that one, it really helps to be a leader in your market, kind of the one of the top two or so. But then there's a long tail of just any company, if they want, if you're selling, whatever the case may be, to have Bitcoin on your balance sheet, and make some sense of that. So I think that's still a long-term strategy. And I think that we're in a healthier spot now that some of this has been kind of, the froth has been reduced.
So over the next year, what would you say you're feeling the most bullish about? And then what gives you a little bit more concern?
I think Bitcoin's in a good space for the next 12 months. I think we've seen a decent amount of washout. So just unlevered self-custodial Bitcoin is, I think, in a great space right now. Some of the better treasury companies that are either cash flow neutral or positive and their MNAVs have come down a lot. I think that's been somewhat de-risked, especially if they're the ones that also are pretty low leverage. I think those are in decent shape. Gold I like longer term, but the value investor in me is a little bit, it came up pretty high pretty fast.
Yeah.
I started warning about that back in April, and it did this pretty long consolidation. It recently just broke out of it. So I got a little bit more kind of bullish again, but it's still just a little frothy. We'll see.
Okay.
I've been, emerging markets are one of the areas that, I've actually kind of liked, or at least select emerging markets. It was kind of off people's radar. But it's something that, I've been pretty bullish on, and I still kind of continue to be probably for the next 12 months or so. I still think there's kind of room in the cycle for that. But I do think that probably unlevered Bitcoin is in a pretty good space right now.